Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons. We're going to talk about Bigby Presents The Glory of the Giants. Brand new Dungeons & Dragons book drops, and what I want to talk about today is what happens when a D&D Canon hardback drops and what it means. So first of all, the first thing that happens is thousands of YouTube videos, right? Social media gets flooded because everybody, whether you love Dungeons & Dragons or hate Dungeons & Dragons, rushes to cover it, right? And so that's a big deal, right? And this doesn't happen anywhere else, right? It really doesn't happen anywhere else. They, like many other tabletop role-playing games that try to compete with D&D, do huge lifts and, do something that isn't accomplished for them. It doesn't even echo. Like, it doesn't echo outside of their community. It barely even echoes in their community, right? So that's a big deal. So let me give my review real quick. 5 out of 5 stars. I am extremely excited about Bigby's Presents. And by the way, why am I even talking to you about Bigby's Presents? Because I have the book digitally, right? And what's really fascinating is the way I knew. So basically, I found this out because somebody's like, hey, here's my coverage of Bigby's Presents. And I was like, okay, you're giving coverage from, you're covering this because you got a hardback early. And he's like, no, I have my digital access. And if you bought the bundle, you have digital. So I was literally told by a YouTuber that I had access to the book. I ran right over to D&D Beyond. Oh, there it is, right? So it's a delight and a surprise. And I have to say, this is really new. This is a completely new experience, just dealing with how I get my Dungeons & Dragons. I will tell you right now, as it stands right now, I will never buy a physical book in an FLGS again, right? And the reason why is, to me, a Dungeons & Dragons D&D Canon hardback is a physical book, a talisman that contains an entity gem, which is the digital, right? Like, and to me, and I think Dragonlance was the first one I did this with. I will never buy a D&D book without physical and digital. That is a D&D Canon. And if you own one or the other, I don't think you own a D&D Canon hardback. A D&D Canon hardback is a physical talisman, a book that contains the digital heart, right? Like, and you have to have both, right? So that you have a record of what happened in D&D history, an unchangeable record written in stone, which is paper, and the one that's going to change, right? Like, because I don't think they've allowed even a single D&D Canon hardback to remain the same on D&D Beyond, right? But if you have the physical, you know what the history of the product is, right? So what's really interesting about D&D, about Bigby's Presents, Glory of the Giants, is, I think what's really fascinating to me about Bigby's Presents, Glories of the Giants, is specifically what they did with, so let's talk about this. So I am really fascinated by what they specifically did with So they did a lot with this book. Oh yes. So let's talk about what happened with Bigby's, right? So when we get these new D&D Canon hardbacks, what actually happens with them, right? Well, let's talk about just three typical books, right? Journey of the Radiant Citadel. Honestly, it is the only D&D book I've ever been disappointed with. And the reason, and it's interesting, it's the only D&D Canon hardback I've ever been disappointed with. And the reason why is there's not a reason in the world that any player would ever touch that book, right? There's nothing in it for them. There are no new spells, there are no new magic items, there are no new subclasses, there are no species options, nothing, right? Like, so that book, it's a disappointment, right? So when a D&D Canon hardback comes out, I'd say it has a 1 to 3% chance of being a next Radiance, right? Radiant Citadel, a disappointment, right? Then it has Keys from the Golden Vault. Great book. Loved it, enjoyed it. Great D&D Canon hardback that completely delivers as a D&D Canon hardback. And then Bigby's Presents, right? Now, Bigby's Presents is exactly like Dragonlance Shadow of the Dragon Queen, and also like Spelljammer. These were huge. These not only delivered as a D&D Canon hardback, but really also, and this is the critical part, not only did they deliver as D&D Canon hardbacks, they actually, what I think is really interesting about them is they changed Dungeons & Dragons fundamentally. They changed Dungeons & Dragons as a brand, as a product, as a tabletop role-playing game experience. As specifically, the play at the table, they fundamentally changed it, right? The Spelljammer book said this is how a setting is presented now, right? Like, you get a unique book, right? You get a monster manual for that setting. You get an adventure for that setting. And you get a guide for that setting, each in an individual book. And that thing is going to go around the table and be literally used by player and dungeon master. And Spelljammer, there's been terrible lies going around the internet saying, oh, Spelljammer was a failure. You think it was like they just reprinted Planescape in literally the exact same format, and the reason why was it was a massive success, right? And the reality is we don't know the numbers. We just don't get numbers for current. We get numbers for products that are decades old, right? And even those numbers aren't even real. They're just like, oh, I am a disgruntled TSR employee. Let me leak all this, right? Like, it's not real data, in my humble opinion, right? Ben Grimm, I'm sure, disagrees, right? Yeah, it's the whole thing, right? So, but these fundamentally changed Dungeons & Dragons forever, and I think that Bigby's Presents Glory of the Giants, what it did was it said, we are going to take specific monsters and give their entire family coverage at the D&D Canon hardback level. So this really is Fizzbands, but for giants, right? It is saying we're going to go into giants specifically and cover them in massive depth, right? And make sure that they're accessible to every player, make sure that they are fully understood by the Dungeon Master, and say, these are not like any other, giants really aren't like any other monster in the monster manual. And what you're really getting is a new, say, we actually, in, 3rd edition, we actually got, hey, here's, Monster Manual 2. They're not going to do that going forward. They're going to say, hey, this monster is not like other monsters. And you are going to get an entire massive amount of, you are going to get a really significant, entire massive amount of additional content for this monster in every single possible format, right? Of that monster. And explore their religion, explore their equipment, explore their lore, explore every single aspect of it. So this is a monster manual that is specific to just giants. That is a new established level of quantity for one monster and quality for one monster. And I think we could be getting, what else are we going to get? Are we going to get a goblin book? Like an entire book that goes into goblins. Could we get an entire book on unicorns, right? Could we get an entire book on... And actually, it's interesting, too. I feel like we already got an entire book on demons, right? I think Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes is really a demon book, right? But this acknowledges that, Bigby's acknowledges this is just for this one thing. So, fantastic book, 5 out of 5 stars. And this is a change Dungeons & Dragons Forever D&D canon, right? And it points to a future, and it points to a possibility for Dungeons & Dragons with the present, right? And I'm thoroughly impressed, really, really massively impressed with what they've done with Bigby's. Every single word of that is my humble opinion. What's important is when I get to hear your humble opinion, when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.